Our panel will explore the future of GIS data curation in libraries, and speakers will address the traditional ways libraries have incorporated GIS services and how researchers are using GIS.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming. As Cynthia mentioned, I'm Jennifer Moore and I'm the GIS and Anthropology Librarian at Washington University. I'll start by saying that when I joined Washington University, I was only the Anthropology Librarian. And in my first meeting with my department chair, I learned that one of their biggest needs was for the library to take their geospatial data. So because I have an interest in data curation and GIS, I began becoming more acquainted with the field, but I will say I'm not an expert. So what my presentation will include is both research I've done, but also I reached out to experts, people who are actually curating geospatial data, and asked them what their greatest challenges were. Cynthia introduced the data curation lifecycle to us, and as much as possible, I'm going to try to relate what I talk about to steps in the lifecycle. Probably you'll just notice them by the arrow on the slide more than me remembering to tell you that this is when this might happen. But I do hope that there's some connection between the two ideas, and even to everyone that's spoken so far and that will speak. One of the data curators I spoke to was from Cornell. And he said one of the biggest issues they face is encouraging researchers to give their data in the first place. And that's because it is not a painless process. And one of the jobs of the data curator is to make it as painless as possible. This isn't something that is necessarily particular to geospatial data curation, but because it is a complex data formats, it can be a little bit more of an issue. So the first thing we need to think about with it is provenance, which is the origination of the data. And really there are 2 points to consider in that. One is where did it come from, where did it start its life, and also where did the researcher get it. So they could have collected original data points themselves. They could be using licensed data, they could have purchased it outright, it could be public domain. All of these possibilities have their own issues. The most tricky one, I think, is licensed data, because every single license is different, and the data curator has to give attention to that license to know what the researcher is even able to share. As Karen pointed out, researchers are increasingly asked to share their data from their granting organizations. If they're using licensed data, they might be inhibited from doing that. And even if their license allows it, what happens when their license runs out? So there's no one good answer to that. I'm sorry. But hopefully we can have discussion about it. I'm sure there are people in the room with expertise. Oops. In relation to where it originated from, how do we know if it's authoritative? Often when we think about, as data curators, when we think about authoritative, we want the closest to the original collection. But sometimes the data is improved by value-added information that some other entity has added. So is raw data more authoritative, or is value-added data more authoritative? Is it better? Does it matter who the source of the collection is? And probably it does. Quality is an issue that cartographers have faced for centuries. Is this data right? And as a data curator, we definitely want to assist the researcher in putting forth good quality data, because often what we know about researchers, the end user is also the data provider in many cases. Depending on their level of expertise, a lot of time they believe the data that they find, whether or not it's right or not. So as data curators, we have to give attention to whether it is in fact quality data. So that kind of connects to derivatives. All of these things really intersect and overlap. So there's the license issue. What can we do? What kind of derivatives can we make from our original data? Once they've got the value-added elements and they've been changed and manipulated, are they still authoritative, and how do we present them in our repository? That also speaks to accuracy. And the other issue, which is really a moving target for geospatial data, is the currency. Because the data curator wants to keep the most recent data available in the repository. So it's an ongoing relationship with the data provider and the data curator to make that happen. And that can be a lot of legwork, really. And that's tied to versioning. So we need to not only keep the data up to date, but we need to make sure we're aware of the different versions that have been that have existed and have been in the repository. Part of the complication with this is the diverse data structure of GIS data. Oftentimes, as you know, as practitioners, in your research or in your work, you use a lot of different kinds of data formats, sometimes within the same container. And that is a complicated issue for a data curator because it's hard to extract the different layers and make them make sense again without the context. And that we'll talk a little bit about the issue of metadata again, but geospatial data is so diverse. It could be in it's continuous, it's discrete, it's together, it's those two things together, and this becomes an issue, especially if the data curator doesn't have geospatial expertise. And that ties us to data management. So we also, everyone in the room, I'm sure, also realizes that geospatial data is very large. One of the curators I spoke to said that sometimes they have to break the files apart to do anything with them at all. And even sometimes they have to aggregate. And this kind of is an issue when we think about curation, because we are trying to preserve the best quality, best representative of the data that we have. And if we have to break it into these pieces, there are issues there. Also, the formats that are involved, and again, there are many, but for example, when we create geospatial data, there isn't one standardized format that everybody says this is the best. Some formats are becoming obsolete, like coverage files, proprietary files, which are not necessarily supported across the board, like file geodatabases, which offer us such robust possibilities when we work with GIS data, but are not versatile. Shapefiles are more versatile, even though they're also proprietary, but they're more widely supported. So I think data curators really prefer that data comes in the shapefile format, but you can't really ask that of researchers, especially when there's a tool like file geodatabases that is more versatile in their day-to-day work. And another issue is the best practice of data management. And one of the curators I spoke to, Dorothea Salo, said one great issue is researchers' lack of value of data longevity and ad hoc processes when they're working with GIS data. And I think that Michael said it really well, the heat of the moment. You're not thinking about what it's going to be like to find or use this data or let someone else use it. You're trying to accomplish your analyzation process. So it's something that something we sort of have to promote before people start working with GIS data in depth, so that when they are in the heat of the moment, it's a practice. It's not something they have to develop on the spot. Ad hoc processes never tend to work out so well in the long run. The other issue is naming conventions. I'm actually sorting through some metadata that was delivered to us, and there's some files that are called things like tiff.tiff. And, sid.sid. I mean, it's just not there was one actually called metadata.shape. So, I mean, we have to establish these things because, again, with ad hoc processes, we don't necessarily make the best decisions. So, and another issue with data management is when the curator gets the data from the geospatial researcher, all of the fields that are in the data may not be meaningful to everyone. So there are two things we can think about in terms of cleaning up those fields. Number one, can metadata sort it out? Well, if we apply the right amount of metadata so people can understand the context of this, will that solve the problem? Or is it something that just needs to be removed? Keith Jenkins particularly mentioned this. And also there's the issue if they're working with subjects that may be protected, like they have Are you familiar with the IRB? It's a human research requirement. So they might want to de-identify people in those fields or take it out altogether. And then the question is that the job of the data curator or is that the job of the researcher? The researcher has the subject expertise. The data curator is trying to make this process as easy as possible for the researcher. Does the researcher have time? In the end, it's probably some combination of the two. So the whole process, if you hadn't already thought this yourself, is very time-consuming. You know, it takes a lot of work to get the data in the kind of shape it needs to be in order to be useful to other people and to be preserved in the long term. And one of the main issues, and you've heard about it many times already in this presentation, is metadata. It's really the backbone of the curation process. And data curators say it's a big challenge because researchers often don't document their data along the way. And researchers say they don't want to be bothered learning a metadata standard so that they can share their research. They need it to be a simple form and as easy as possible and to take as little time as possible. So in the best case scenario, we provide good tools that make this collaboration between the researcher and the data curator easy. However, we don't necessarily have those tools yet. One of the researchers that I spoke to is Dorothea, and when I say that she's an expert in the field, I mean she's a rock star. She knows her stuff. And so her complaint about the ridiculous complexity of FGDC metadata should not be taken lightly. One issue with geospatial data in general is that a lot of metadata standards try to incorporate a wrapper to bring in the administrative and the technical metadata. Geospatial metadata standards don't seem to have this, as far as I know up to now. The administrative and technical metadata look at things like archival rights and data acquisition and transfer, and this is under development in the geospatial realm, but not quite. There are working groups and standard bodies that do keep looking at these things, but right now we don't have the best answer for metadata. Let me just back up and say, descriptive metadata is what we want from researchers. The wrapper is what would capture the administrative and technical metadata. Yes?
Past metadata. So to me, metadata is two different things. What is the history? You know, where did this come from? The genealogy, if you will. It's also how I'm going to go back and find data again. Where is visual search? We're talking about visual data. There's, to the best of my knowledge, nobody developing any capability for metadata as a visual search. I'm just throwing it out there as a possibly rhetorical question.
Well, let's kind of discuss it as a group when we come to the end. Is that all right?
Fine.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you. And it does bring us nicely into data access, because that's why we need metadata, whether in whatever form that it is. If we expect, we don't want to just archive and preserve this data for posterity and keep it in a cave. We need it to be accessible. And I think Karen and Cynthia both touched on these things well, and I know Chris will say a lot more. And Michael really expressed the reasons we need these things to be findable and as easily findable as possible. But to just highlight that the data curator's job doesn't end at making the data preserved. It's an ongoing process, because the data provider is the data user and vice versa. So I just wanted to mention a few good examples of data curation. And when I say good examples, I kind of mean that they're intentionally working on making these processes better. And I'm sure you're familiar with GeoMap. It's it started with the North Carolina Spatial Data Archival Project, and it's a multi-state project. And they are very intentionally looking at what we need to do to preserve geospatial data long term. On the question of metadata, they wrote a report saying, what we need is not here, maybe we need to combine a couple of standards to make it work. So they actually use FGDC and Dublin Core together. Dublin Core is a very kind of broad metadata standard that put together with FGDC kind of makes it a little more discoverable, but the FGDC offers the geospatial expertise. Inside Idaho is a geospatial repository out of the University of Idaho, and it's covering the whole state. But they've just recently published an article on the issues they've faced in geospatial preservation and archiving, and are making some great strides, and is a good starting place if you're interested in looking at the issues behind geospatial data curation. And of course I mentioned QGAR, which was one of our QGAR, which is one of our experts spoke to us from there. And they've been leaders in the field of geospatial data curation and preservation and sharing for, I guess, about 10 years, I'd say. So finally, just from our point of view, we're in a starting place, really. So I just tried to pull together a few things that we're thinking about in terms of what we need to do to get on the path to curating our researchers' geospatial data, because it's being asked of us. And one of the things is the very first starting point is to anticipate these difficulties and find ways to address them. And one of those ways is creating a geospatial data collection policy. And a good example from that is NGDA, which is a collaboration between, I believe it's Stanford and University of California, Berkeley. And they have a model for creating this geospatial data collection policy that clarifies to the people you're serving what it is you can and want to do for them and what their responsibilities are. We also need to foster this culture of best practices. So we have to help researchers make these processes more regular in terms of their naming conventions, their application of metadata, etc. And that has to be an intentional effort from the libraries. And as well as developing relationships with other institutions. I think in all the examples we've heard today, we haven't heard many efforts that were one institution working on its own. And certainly for preservation, other institutions need to be involved in order to keep the copies preserved in the long term. And working on a geoportal for our research that can be either ours in consortium with others, or something we contributed to make our researchers' data also available, are things we're thinking about. So anyway, Chris is going to take us into digital assets management systems and talk a little more about access.